Chapter 14, the brain is what we will be discussing in this video and its components. So the first part here, we said that there were four main parts of the brain, and we will be discussing the brainstem and reticular formation first. The brainstem is composed of three parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Oftentimes, the medulla oblongata is simply referred to as the medulla. The medulla is continuous with the continuous with the upper part of your spinal cord, or the superior part of the spinal cord, and it contains a portion of both motor and sensory tracts. So remember, when we talk about the nervous system, we will be talking about our motor and sensory tracts. So it has both motor and sensory tracts. It also contains the nuclei of origin for cranial nerves, 7 and 12. Make sure that not only do you know these cranial nerve numbers, but you know the names for these cranial nerves. There will be a PowerPoint on cranial nerves that will go more into detail. So it contains the nuclei of origin for cranial nerves 8 and 12. The structural regions of the medulla include the pyramids and the inferior olivary nucleus. So here you see the inferior olivary nucleus, and then we are showing the pyramids. So decussation of the pyramids results when our neurons in the left cerebral cortex control the skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. So you see we are crossing, in this instance, from the right to the left, and then from the left to the right. So it happens at this level here, and it is how we control opposite sides, how the left cerebral cortex will control the skeletal muscles on the right, and then the right cerebral cortex will then, of course, control the skeletal muscles on the left. The inferior olivary neurons will relay impulses from proprioceptors to the cerebellum. Functional regions here in the medulla include nuclei that are reflex centers for regulation of heart rate, respiratory rate, vasoconstriction, so constriction or closing of the blood vessels, swallowing, coughing, vomiting, sneezing, and hiccuping. The first three of these are considered to be vital reflexes. So here I listed those cranial nerves again for you, 8 and 12. And then the pyramids, I showed those, and the inferior olivary nuclei. And remember, decussation of the pyramids is how we cross, and we have the right cerebral cortex control the left skeletal muscles. And then the functional regions we said would be heart rate, respiratory rate, the vasoconstrictions, swallowing, coughing, vomiting, sneezing, and hiccuping. These first three, the heart rate, respiratory rate, and vasoconstriction, those are considered your vital reflexes because, of course, you need those things to go on so that you can continue living. Next is the pons. The pons is located superior to the medulla, so we've worked our way from the spinal cord to the brainstem, which is continuous with it, but first with the medulla oblongata and now higher up the pons. It will connect the spinal cord with the brain and link parts of the brain with one another by way of tracts. So remember, when we discussed nervous tissue in chapter 12, we discussed your tracts and what they were. It will relay our nerve impulses that are related to voluntary skeletal movements from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. The pons also contains what we call a pneumotaxic and an apneustic area. The pneumotaxic and apneustic area, these help control respiration along with the respiratory center that we had in the medulla. You also have nuclei for cranial nerves 5 through 7 and the vestibular branch of cranial nerve 8 originating here in the pons. The midbrain will be superior to the medulla oblongata as well. It conveys motor impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and spinal cord. It also sends sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus, and it helps to regulate auditory and visual reflexes. There are some structures within the midbrain that we will mention here. Those include the cerebral peduncles, the corpora quadrinemini, the left and the right substantia nigra, and the left and the right red nucleus and the medial lemniscus. We'll concentrate more on about what those do in later sections or later chapters. So we also have some cranial nerves that will originate from the midbrain. Those will be 3 and 4. And the function we said was to convey those motor impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and the spinal cord, and then to send the sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus and regulate the auditory and visual reflexes. Now, reticular formation will consist of small areas of gray matter. So small areas of gray matter that are interspersed among fibers of white matter, and there are both sensory and motor signals. All right, both sensory and motor. This will help to regulate your reticular formation, helps to regulate your muscle tone. It will alert the cortex to incoming sensory signals through the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And this RAS, or this reticular activating system, this is also responsible for maintaining our consciousness and our awakening from our sleep. The cerebellum, before we continue actually, the functions of the brainstem and the other structures, there's a table located in your book, table 14.2, that goes over the summary of those structures and their functions. Now we'll move on to the cerebellum. The cerebellum occupies the inferior and the posterior aspects of your cranial cavity. and it has two hemispheres and a central vermis. This central vermis is constricted. The word vermis means worm-like, so you see it looks like worms. The cerebellum, it will be attached to the brain stem by three pairs of cerebellar peduncles. So here you see these superior, middle, and inferior peduncles that are attaching it to the brainstem. And functions here include coordination of skeletal muscle contractions and the maintenance of normal muscle tone, posture, and balance. So skeletal muscle contractions, muscle tone, posture, and balance. When we have injury or some kind of impairment of the cerebellum, we can have ataxia result. And ataxia is that wobbly type of loss of balance. Next is the diencephalon, and the diencephalon has three parts to it: a thalamus, a hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. You can see here each of the parts we've talked about and the parts we will be talking about. The thalamus is located superior to your midbrain, and it contains nuclei that serve as relay stations for all sensory impulses except smell. It does not contain nuclei that serve as relay stations for smell. These relay stations for all sensory impulses except smell will then go to the cerebral cortex. There are 7 major groups of thalamic nuclei on each side, and these 7 major thalamic nuclei are going to help with conscious recognition of pain and temperature, as well as with some light touch and pressure, and then of course with your cognition, so that you will know what is occurring and what's going on. And so, as we said, cognition, so the thalamus is an essential role in your awareness and your acquisition of knowledge. So think about your learning process. Your thalamus is working. The hypothalamus is found inferior to the thalamus, hence its name, hypo, meaning below or less than the thalamus, and it has 4 major regions: mammillary, tuberal, supraoptic, and preoptic. Your thalamus is going to control many of our body activities, and so therefore it will be one of your major regulators of homeostasis. This will be your brain's connection to your endocrine system, you'll learn later. So as far as functions go for the hypothalamus, it functions in regulation of our emotional and behavioral patterns. It will regulate eating and drinking through a feeding center and a satiety center and the thirst center. Also helps control your body temperature, and then it can help to regulate our circadian rhythms and the states of consciousness that we have. Next is the epithalamus. The epithalamus will lie superior and posterior to the thalamus, and in your epithalamus you have your pineal gland, and you also have the habular nuclei. So the pineal gland will secrete melatonin, and this helps to influence our diurnal cycles in conjunction with the hypothalamus. So you've probably heard of people taking melatonin for sleep. And that's because it helps to regulate those sleep and wake cycles. And so this is where it is naturally secreted from in our bodies. Now, the nuclear nuclei. They are involved in olfaction, which is smell. So this is where we equate those emotional responses to odors. And then next we have some circumventricular organs, or CVOs, of the diencephalon. So these are parts of the diencephalon that can actually monitor chemical changes in the blood because they lack a blood-brain barrier. So because they don't have a blood-brain barrier, chemicals are able to enter in, and it can serve as a monitor or something that can help us respond. So these circumventricular organs include portion of the hypothalamus, your pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. There are a few other nearby structures as well, but those are the main ones. And so these CVOs function to coordinate our homeostatic activities of the endocrine and the nervous system working together. You'll have another table that also summarizes the diencephalon in your book. All right, the cerebrum. Within our cerebrum, we have gray matter that will have billions of neurons, and it's 2 to 4 millimeters thick here, this gray matter. And then it will be separated or have gyri, fissures, and sulci in it. So your gyri are the convolutions, or the little twist and the turn. Single is a gyrus, plural gyri. And then also we have fissures. The fissures are deeper grooves. As you see here, it enters down further. So you have a fissure that separates the two halves. And then in between each individual gyri, or twist and turn, not nearly as deep as an actual fissure, you have a sulcus, or sulci, plural. And so the sulcus will be much shallower than the fissures. And then deep to this cortex, of course, will be white matter, because we had the gray matter on the outer portion. We talked about that when we talked about our nervous tissue in chapter 12. So we're beginning to put things together into their functional place. So this white matter, and it is composed of tracts of neurons, because in the white matter, groups of neurons together are tracts, and it will connect parts of the brain to each other and the spinal cord. So we have a right and a left hemisphere of our brain, and so the corpus callosum is the connection between the right and the left hemispheres of the cerebrum. It is separated into these right and left hemispheres by a longitudinal fissure, because it runs lengthwise or longwise, and that communication, we said, can happen by the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of transverse white fibers. So let's look at that. So here's that longitudinal fissure going all the way down, and then we'll have the corpus callosum transversing across to allow them to connect. All right, so your cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes, and then there is a 5th portion, the insula, as well. The insula cannot be seen from the outer part. It is an internal portion of the cerebrum. So those lobes are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is at the base of your skull, whereas your frontal lobe, of course, will be at the cranium, or your front of your skull. And the temporal lobe, if we think about it, our ear would be right below this temporal lobe, right about this area. And then here you can see they've given you an outline of the insula, because remember, it is within. These four lobes are created by either sulci or fissures, creating the division here. So here we're showing you the parieto-occipital sulcus, transverse fissure here, and so forth. Excuse me. Excuse me. The cerebral lobes, we said we named them, and then that fifth part, the insula, can't be seen. All right. The cerebral white matter tracts is under the cortex, and it consists of myelinated axons, and these myelinated axons will run in three principal directions. So these directions are with association fibers, commissural fibers, and projection fibers. The projection fibers will form ascending and descending tracts. Your association fibers connect and transmit nerve impulses between gyri that are in the same hemisphere. The commissural fibers will connect gyri in corresponding or they'll connect corresponding gyri in the opposite hemisphere. And then projection fibers will form these ascending and descending tracts that will transmit your impulses from the cerebrum to other parts of the brain and spinal cord. So when we were talking about our spinal cord, we talked about those ascending and those descending tracts. The ascending tracts carried the impulses to the brain. The descending tracts would then carry it away from the brain and towards the spinal cord. So you have those projection fibers. Now, between the gyri, same hemisphere, so we will stay right to right or left to left. And then corresponding gyri in opposite hemisphere, so we will move from right to left or left to right. All right, so here you just get a better image of this with a medial view, so we actually remove the gray matter. The basal nuclei of the cerebrum here are paired masses of gray matter in each cerebral hemisphere. So this would be the paired masses of gray matter, and we have three of them. They are the globus pilatus, the putamen, and the caudate nucleus. The globus pilatus will be closer to your thalamus, while your putamen is going to be closer to the cerebral portion. And then there is a thin sheet of gray matter situated lateral to this putamen called the claustris, and it is considered by some to be the subdivision of the basal nuclei. The function of the claustrum in humans has not yet been clearly defined, but we think it may be involved in visual attention. And then this third basal nuclei is the caudate nucleus. So you can see them all gathered here. We will be talking a little bit more about them in our couple other chapters from here. Now, the limbic system is found in the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. It functions in our emotional aspects of behavior and memory, and it's also associated with our pleasure and our pain. All right, so we've gone through the main areas here. Now let's talk about the functional organization of the cerebral cortex. So we have specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals that will be processed in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. So in these sensory areas, they are concerned, of course, with the reception and the interpretation of sensory impulses, as their name implies. So we have some important sensory areas that include the primary somatosensory area, your primary visual area, your primary auditory area, and your primary gustatory area. We talk more about what these areas actually do when we talk about the visual or auditory or somatosensory aspects. The motor areas are going to, of course, govern our muscular movement. And so there are two important areas in the two important motor areas, the primary motor area and then Broca's speech area. So we'll talk more about Broca's speech area when we talk about speech, but it is the motor part or the actual movement of your speech. And then our association areas are concerned more with the integrative function, so the complexity of things such as memory, emotions, reasoning, will, judgment, personality traits, and intelligence. So we have a somatosensory association area, a visceral association area, an auditory, and then we have Wernicke's or the posterior language area, common integrative, a premotor, frontal eyelid field, and language areas. Now, Wernicke's is mentioned with the language as well. So this is that integrative. So this is not the movement of actually being able to speak, but this is the formulation and knowing what words you should be using to create your speech or that recall what the word means. So here, we're just showing you where these areas are located. Please do not fret over the location of all of these functional areas. Next is hemispheric lateralization. So remember we've said that you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. So this table just gives you some of the functional differences between the right and the left hemispheres. The two hemispheres of the cerebrum are not bilaterally symmetrical, either anatomically or in their functionality. And so with the functional asymmetry, this is what we call the hemispheric lateralization. So because functionally they are asymmetrical, we call it hemispheric lateralization. And then we'll put into each hemisphere what we typically see or what that hemisphere will be for. Our left hemisphere is more important for our right-handed control, so it controls the opposite side. And it's going to be spoken and written language and then numerical and scientific skills. So you've heard people say, I'm more right-brained, I'm more left-brained. And so that left brain, that is, I like logic, I like numbers, I like math, I like science. Written language, I like to write my notes to study. And then the right hemisphere is more important for our left-handed control, and it's more musical, artistic awareness, space and pattern perception, insight, imagination, generating mental images of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. So this may be the person who wants to draw a picture to help them study, or they have to have music going when they're studying. That's that right hemisphere. And then the next thing we have are brain waves that indicate the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex. So we have 4 different types of brain waves. We have alpha, beta, theta, and delta. And so when we record these waves, we are recording electrical potentials generated by our brain cells, and so they are brain waves. We can then take these brain waves generated by the cerebral cortex and record them as an electroencephalogram or an EEG, not to be confused with your EKG or ECG. That's the recording of the electricity of your heart. Here it's the recording of the electricity in your brain. And so we said alpha, beta, theta, and delta waves. You have a quick summary that gives you what each wave is for and when you might see the waves being shown. But we can use these EEG waves to help diagnose epilepsy and other seizure disorders. infectious diseases, tumors, trauma, hematomas, any kind of metabolic abnormality, degenerative diseases, and then also to see periods of unconsciousness and confusion. And then it can be helpful in providing information regarding our sleep and wakefulness. It's helpful in regarding sleep and wakefulness because of these four waves, we will exhibit different types of waves in different parts of our sleep cycle. So an EEG can be one of the criteria that we use to confirm brain death. And so with that, to confirm brain death, if we take two EEGs 24 hours apart and we have the complete absence of brain waves, then that is said to be brain death. Also, with brain injuries, we can look at these brain waves. So memory lapse can occur. We can have various degrees of brain injury, a concussion or contusion, or even so much so as a laceration. We will pause at this point, and then we will have a couple of other lectures to go into more detail about the cranial nerves and disorders of the brain.